So we got started with our deployment, and therefore let's now go back to the choosing a database part. Until now, we're still using SQLite, but I did already mention that this can have a couple of downsides, a couple of disadvantages. Therefore, you very often will go for a real database server, typically MySQL or PostgreSQL. Both are popular and great, and there are dedicated sources out there which compare the two. The good thing is that Django is compatible with both. You can also use Django models with both. Therefore, we can choose either of the two, and I will go with PostgreSQL here, but the steps will basically be the same for MySQL. Now, if you search for Django PostgreSQL, you will find various articles, and you'll also find an article from the official docs. There, you'll learn that indeed PostgreSQL is one of the supported database engines, which Django officially supports. And you can learn more about databases in general here. Now, if we click on PostgreSQL, we learn that for using it, we'll need to install a specific package, this psycopg2 package. So we will need to install this package, and if we click on it, we can go to the official docs of that package, and we see the command we can run for installing it. Now, I want to execute this, but make sure that you do execute it in this virtual environment, so that this virtual environment is activated. Then run this command, and this will now install this extra driver, which it in the end is, which is required for PostgreSQL to work. Now, once you install that, we need to update our requirements text file, and we do this by again running pip freeze or python-mpip, both works, freeze, and point at this requirements text file. And this will now update it and also include this package now. And that's important to make sure that Elastic Beanstalk, or whichever hosting provider you are using, does install this package as well. It's not all we have to do though. We also have to go to Settings PY and then there work on the databases config. Because this config is set up for SQLite, but now we want to use a PostgreSQL database. And for this, we actually first of all need such a database. Now, when it comes to adding a database, you again have many options. You can basically rent a database server from any provider out there, but AWS has a built-in database service, which is very convenient to use and which also can be used for free, at least to get started. It's called RDS, which stands for Relational Database Service, and it's a managed service, which is great because that means that AWS will take care about security updates, it can take care about backing up your database, about keeping it up and running, and you won't have any headaches about this. So we'll go to RDS here, and then on this RDS page, we want to create a new database instance. For this, we can go to Databases and then Create Database. And now here we got various options, but we want to go with PostgreSQL here as an engine type. We can leave the version and then here go to Templates and use the free tier option here. And that's important. Of course, it will be less performant than production, for example, but it's free and it's enough for us to see how it works. Then we can add this an identifier, and I'll name this Django-blog. And we now also need to set up a master username and password, which we use for accessing our database. And I'll name this Django-blog, one word, and then any password of your choice. Now, of course, you want to pick a secure password here, and mine is too short. So let me update this. And now I did pick a password and a username. Now we want to leave the defaults here regarding the database instance size. There are more performant ones available, but not in the free tier, so we'll stick to that. We can leave all the storage settings here. We can enable storage auto-scaling, but we can also disable this here. This would make sure that if we run out of space, it would automatically add more space, but here for this demo, we don't need that. But of course, if you do plan to use all of that in production, you definitely wanna dive into those settings and understand if you need that and enable it if you do. We can leave all those settings here, and you might wanna restrict this to internal access only, so that indeed our server, our running application does have access, but the outside world doesn't. But I will switch to yes here and grant public access so that I actually can also connect to the database from outside the running Django application. So connect to it if it's not deployed, so that I actually can create the database schema and the super user ahead of time. So I'll choose yes here. Now here for VPC security group, we want to create a new security group, and I'll name this Django-DB. You can leave the other settings as they are. We can leave database authentication as it is. We can look into additional config, for example, how we could update things and so on, where we, for example, can configure backups, but all the defaults here should be fine as well. And then you see your estimated monthly cost, and here you see that we're within the free tier. So now we can create this database. And this will now spin up a managed database server for us. Now we need to make sure that our Django application is able to connect to this database. And that should be possible both locally from our local system as well as once it's deployed. In reality, you might also want to maintain two different databases, one for development and one for production, but here, to keep things a bit simpler, we'll use one and the same database. So how do we now make sure that Django is able to connect to that database? Well, we need to go to our settings py file. Instead of the SQLite free backend, we want to use the PostgreSQL backend, written like this. Then we also need to set the name, but also a couple of other names here. We'll also need to set the user. We'll need to set the password and also the host and the port. Now we can get all that data from our RDS dashboard here, basically. We will need to wait until it's done with the setup though, and that can still take a few minutes. So I will be back once this is fully initialized and up and running. So now this is done finishing up. Now when it comes to the database name, we actually have no name here. So that can be an empty string. Now that of course depends on your setup, but here we can see if we go to configuration that we have no database name. Now for the user, we can click on View Credential Details, and we see the username and password which we configured a couple of minutes ago. So we want to use that data here. Of course, you want to maybe use a more secure password than I'm doing here. You also can consider using environment variables here instead to make sure that you're not exposing that kind of information to other people. If you never share your settings py file with anyone, you won't have that problem. But if you, for example, push it to GitHub, you might want to use environment variables here, even if you do use the same values during production as you do in development. You then simply want to make sure that for development, you also set environment variables, which is possible as well. You can set environment variables for any Python program you might be executing. Here I'm hard coding it though, because I'm not sharing this file with anyone anyways. Now for the host, that's our endpoint here, which we want to copy and plug this in here. And for the port, it's this port address, which we find on the connectivity and security part of our RDS instance. Now, thereafter, you want to save that settings py file, and now I want to connect to this database locally. I want to run my local project, my local Django project, or to be precise, I don't want to run the project here, I want to run my migrations instead. Because we have a brand new database now, and I want to make sure that my database tables are set up correctly and that all those initial migrations are being executed. So therefore, with settings py updated, here in the context of this virtual environment, I will run python manage py migrate. And this will now connect to this database. And actually here, let's set Postgres as a database name instead of nothing. And then repeat this, since Postgres is actually the default database name assumed by this database, even though in the dashboard it didn't show any name. But use Postgres instead for running this command, because otherwise it will fail. And with Postgres as a name and all the other settings set up as mentioned, you see that the connection succeeds and the migrations are written to the database. If that is not working for you, double check your settings here. And of course, double check the setup process for your RDS instance, that you didn't skip any step there. And of course, also make sure you have no local firewall or VPN or proxy setup that might be blocking the connection between your local machine and that database. Because now we did talk to that database server in some cloud center by AWS. With that, the migrations are written. Now, as a next step, I want to create a super user because we have a brand new database. No super user exists there. So I will run create super user and then choose any credentials of your choice here. And confirm this. Now my password is too insecure, but I'll still use it here. And I'm good to go. Of course, you want to use a more secure one. Now we can test this locally by again executing run server here, which will start our local development server. However, that fails now because it's not added to allowed hosts because of the environment variable we're waiting for here. Now here we can add localhost as a default in case this environment variable should not be set, as it is during local development. There it is not set, so that localhost is also allowed. And if we update this and reload, we can view our blog. Now, the blog posts are gone because this is a brand new blog now without any initial data. And therefore, of course, we can first of all go to admin and log in with our admin credentials here, which we set up a second ago. And now we can administer our content here. But that's, of course, the application running locally, still connected to this RDS database, though. That's really important. But our goal was not to run it locally, but instead with help of Elastic Beanstalk. Therefore, I'll quit this here. I'll quit this running development server. And instead, we now want to redeploy our updated code, so the updated requirements text file and the updated settings, to Elastic Beanstalk. And that's therefore what we're going to do now. For that, we want to create a new zip file where we also still include the same folders and files as before. Not the SQLite file though, but still all the other core folders and files which I showed before. And we now compress this and give this any name of our choice. And now we want to upload this updated code. For this, we go to the Elastic Beanstalk console. So we can leave the RDS console. We, of course, leave the database up and running, though. And now here, in our Elastic Beanstalk project, we upload and deploy our updated code file. Click deploy here to make sure that these changes to the requirements text file and also to our database settings are having an effect here as well, so that this application then also connects to the RDS database. So let's wait for this deployment to finish up here. And now once this is done, we can visit our website again. And you'll notice that this keeps on spinning for quite some time here and ultimately fails. And now to fix this problem, we'll need to go to RDS, to the RDS console, because it will be related to that. But before we go there, let's actually first go back to the configuration of our Elastic Beanstalk deployment. Because whilst the error is not stemming from there, there still is something we need to change, specifically in the software configuration, and then if we go down to the environment properties, so these environment variables. Keep in mind that there is one variable, this isProduction variable, which we renamed because isProduction was actually a bad name. I renamed it to isDevelopment in our source code, which we redeployed, but here it's still named isProduction. So we should swap this name and we should use inDevelopment here instead, so that we're in line with the environment variable name expected in our settings.py file. The value stays the same, but the name of the variable has to change. This, however, is not responsible for the error we're getting. Nonetheless, let's save this, and now our deployment will be updated. But our application not loading, that's related to a different problem. And for this, we'll need to go back to the RDS console and there to our running database. There in the Connectivity and Security tab, we see this security group part. A security group is in the end like a firewall around that service. It controls the incoming and outgoing traffic. And it turns out that by accepting the default settings here, we configured it such that only traffic from our local machine is allowed to that database, which is why everything did work fine locally. But now we want our deployed application, which is running on some AWS server, to be able to talk to that database as well. And that's not working out of the box. Therefore, we'll need to dive into this security group and change this. So let's click onto that security group. And then for this security group, we need to go to the inbound rules here. With the inbound rules, we configure which kind of traffic is allowed to access the database. And at the moment, we got one rule here, which exposes the correct port, but only for my local IP address. That's not enough. So therefore, instead of just exposing the database to my local IP address, here I want to expose it to anywhere, so to the entire world. You could also come up with different setups, which AWS supports, where you don't need to open this up to the entire world. But for the moment, this is good enough. And we still, of course, have our username and password. So even with that opened up to the entire world, it's still not like everyone is able to access our database just like that. Now we need to save that updated inbound rule. And therefore now we will be able to connect to this database with our deployed application as well. Now we can view this, and now we can also revisit the admin panel here and also work with that. So now we also saw how we could connect a real database or a database server besides SQLite. And that, of course, is also something which you in reality might need to do. So therefore, knowing which key steps are involved and that specifically you will need to tweak those settings in the settings.py file, no matter which service you use, that is something which you always need to be aware of. And therefore, now that we learned this, let's dive back into static files, serving static files, and also working with file uploads.